I grab a leaf slow burn. I can only describe how I'm feeling in 4 letters. I'm good, and evidently I should, cause all the work been put in to vote my friends off with this, and this is only the beginning, so stay.
Welcome, it's the Close the Deal Show. I'm your host, Terrence McCray, rebranding from incarceration. Every week we bring you business information, tips and insights from entrepreneurs, business professionals, and inspired individuals from the San Francisco Bay Area, as well as Los Angeles and beyond. The Close the Deal Show also features public announcements, Entrepreneur Week, and small businesses. And if you're looking for strategies to help you in business or educate the public, then you're in the right place. Thank you for joining us today. My guest is not only a good friend of mine, but is someone who served in the military. And during his time serving in the military, he has not only impacted this country by being a true soldier, but most importantly, he's decided to give back to an organization that he's a member of, which is called Bunkers Lab. So I got to represent all the Bunker Lab vets, as well as the people I had the opportunity to meet yesterday at WeWorks. Don't butcher me if I didn't say your name correctly, but Vanessa Brown and Myra, as well as Keone, if I'm correct. So ladies and gentlemen of the Close the Deal Show, welcome my man, James.
Thank you so much, Terrence. Thank you so much. I appreciate the introduction.
Absolutely. Could you elaborate a little bit about what the military podcast is about?
Yeah, so I did 20 years in the in the Air Force, and sorry, gotta.
Yeah, you good.
Oh, this way. And so I did 20 years in the Air Force, and I did an IT. So about a year before I got out of the Air Force, I started networking. I didn't know anyone really in the business community in Tampa, Florida. I met a guy named Chris Kremitzos who had a business organization called Tampa Bay Business Owners Organization, and got into podcasting, saw this concept of a kind of a podcast network, and decided to not only do a podcast about veteran business, but also co-found a podcast network I do with a friend of mine, Jeffrey Lodick, who worked with me in the Army. He was in the Army, I was in the Air Force. We worked in a joint unit together. So founded the Military Podcast Network. He does a show called On the Other Side, Leadership After Transition. So that was kind of how it got started, and started in 2017 to put together a media company essentially using podcasting to be the voice of these different topics and backgrounds in the military space.
So why do you feel it's so important to bring together former vets to utilize this network opportunity to further their whatever their career is after the military? Why do you think that's so important?
Well, just like the show, another way to get your message out. I just felt podcasting is so powerful. Of you're in people's ear, and it's becoming more of a thing, and in people's cars, and people can be maybe on deployment and download their episodes going into somewhere, and just constantly it's a way to get to people's the pain points and get the resources and information in real time when they need it. That's the gist. Is if I felt we can get a highlight, a show, a podcast, and a voice to these different entities, nonprofits, for-profits or like Bunker Labs, and get the word out for these programs and resources for the people that need it in real time. That's what's really inspired me to be a conduit and build a platform, a media company / platform that could use these new technologies and new media to amplify those messages and those causes and things that are important to the whole entire military space, which is a pretty big thing.
So how do you raise money?
So there's sponsorship. There's you can do we donate onto the website itself, but there's different ways on the veteran business side, doing some things to create programs that can be monetized and stuff like that. So,
when you say the veterans, is it something that most veterans throughout the country know about? Is it something where someone decides to go online after they looked at this show and they're a vet and said that they want to get involved and they have a good idea of things that they see that they want to talk about? How could they learn more about the process of starting their own podcast?
Yeah, so that's one part is the podcast network is able to help people start podcasts. Both part of our we have both helping people start on the military side and on the civilian side. So it sounds kind of weird, but like on the military side, so if someone obviously can always reach out to ask about starting a podcast or even getting in business, and both. That's what's nice about the Bunker Labs partnership, but. Or, me being a city leader here for Bunker Labs, but on if someone wants to learn how to do a podcast and already has kind of something they're doing or wants to, yeah, definitely I'll leave my information at the end, either now or at the end, and definitely reach out to me and we can go from there.
What are the challenges of building this military media network?
I think the challenges is like starting from the base level of not having a background in any of this and kind of building it from the beginning and get the relationships and I think the other part is for as I viewed it as we were building the network is yes, I want a podcast about like let's say and this is just general, but let's say the VA or specific topics about the VA, Veteran Association or Veteran Administration. I would want the right person and the right kind of messaging for that podcast or for that message and media as well. So I bring that up to say those are some of the obstacles at first is like not just figuring out, okay, I want someone, and I think you can kind of talk to this as being a host of this show is like, it's not that someone else can't do a podcast about what you're doing with close the deal, but they're going to do it a little differently than you would do it. And maybe, I want a certain kind of person that wants to give back and that is, like, unfortunately, in every space, there's not everybody, maybe it's somebody that's wanting to be more about themselves and, like, kind of make it all about them instead of truly wanting to help. I think that's where I'm going, where, like, that's a challenge of, like, matching up exactly the messaging you want with the right person as well. And that it makes sense for that person for what they're wanting to do. Because I call that kind of their back end where the media, so the Military Podcast Network media part of that is to get that message out, but they're still doing their thing on the back end, like meaning, if they're talking about, yeah, or even monetizing, but also like whatever their program is, like if they're, say Bunker Labs would be an example, which is, I don't want to really say, like Bunker Labs isn't on the network, but if they were, Bunker Labs has the stuff they're doing. The network would be the podcast network would be the part to get that message out. But what they're doing as a program outside of that, it's just a way to get that exposure for that program, and then they're handling the program behind the scenes, right? That's totally independent of the network. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes all the sense. So what you're doing is you're evaluating what type of content you want to put out there. You don't want to put somebody that's out there and all they have in the background is sex. When ideally they're trying to, deliver a message that is also representing the United States government, where you're trying to pay it forward. So that's the best way I can look at it from the standpoint of any vet. What type of content? Is it radical, you know what I'm saying? Or does it have an inspiration type of empowering story? So,
yeah, and that's why, so to me, it's the same thing with the military. You kind of have core values. There's values that the network has that I want that host and their background to be aligned, and obviously the messaging as well, which you're talking about. So I think there's certain areas that are definitely, we all would agree, like say mental health, to be highlighted. So that would be have a podcast on the network about mental health. So the challenge would be like, okay, I want this podcast, like who would be the right person who's already doing that, who doesn't maybe already have a podcast that could be the good fit for that. So those are all the initial challenges as you start, is like, which, I mean, I think you can relate a little bit personally, where
Absolutely.
When you start in a show like this, whatever long ago you started, at the very beginning, if you're saying you have a platform that you're creating, the same thing on the podcast side, where it's not like we're because my friend and I that started it, we both did certain things in the military that didn't have anything to do with a media company. So I think it's just like that, is those challenges that are getting out there and getting your name out there and getting strategic alliances and relationship building. Those are all the initial, I think, things that as we are early on of starting and growing this media company.
Could you start and explain to my viewers some steps that you took to even come up not only with this idea, but to bring it into fruition?
Absolutely. And so I want to talk about few things when I hear that is, and it's never going to be perfect. And there's, things I would have never foreseen that have happened throughout, that may, like, let's say you're like, I want the perfect website, or I need to do these 3 things before I do it. It's been kind of starting, making sure you just, like, here's the idea. We got the initial idea. The vision and the goals are bigger than the obstacles. So there are always going to be those obstacles. So I think when someone's starting out, you have that idea. And I think you probably talked about it in the show before, and you would continue to say, like, at the very beginning, I had an idea, talked to some people, had enough people to start, and like, okay, let's start and get the message out. And then as you go, it kind of evolves. So how you thought it would be, like, say, even a podcast, what questions should I ask? Like, what should be the format? You can get really quickly overwhelmed by these things, but you'll never know until you kind of put yourself out there and do it. And of course, you were at our cohort yesterday when they were talking about some of these things of people, maybe you say, I don't have enough money, or I don't have the experience, or like someone, like, a big thing as I talk to people about starting a podcast is I'm afraid to hear my own voice, or, or like put my voice out there and like put myself out there. So those are all things as I was starting out, and as I think people start out initially in something that is different than what they're used to. You just have to know the goal and the vision and the end, where you want, I say end, but like where you're trying to make a difference, and you see a problem and you want to fix that problem. I think that's where I started with that being the bigger thing that I wanted to do. And I didn't feel it's like, okay, if it doesn't work, then I never looked at it as like it won't work. But it may not be exactly how I thought it would be. It hasn't. It's been where I thought I was thinking big. There's been opportunities and things that have presented themselves that I would have never thought of initially. So it's just, starting and kind of pivoting and some of these cliche words, but like just doing it and going out there, which I think there's a lot of parallel for what you're doing now and what you've continued to do, and the events that the event that we're going to do at the beginning of next month is kind of the testament of that. Is just, all of a sudden when people see you doing things, then they want to help you and give value to what you're doing. So I hope I answered your question.
Oh, absolutely. You answered it very good. What I'm curious to know is, right, you talked about the challenges, but one of the things I want to know is what particular podcast episode stood out to you on your network?
Oh, wow, that's a hard question. That's very hard. There was early on, I interviewed a guy who, so I came in the military in 1995, of course, all volunteer. I love, I don't know everything about military history, of course, but I love, as I was coming in and even now looking back for the people that kind of paved the way. And so I had not really talked to a lot of people, had great conversations in the past of like what it would have been like to be drafted into the military. So I actually had an interview early on of a person who had been drafted, so I was able to ask and talk about his story, and I just learned so much. So episode like that stands out. But when you're interviewing people, and maybe you have a different opinion, but like there's so many things that stand out. It's hard to really pinpoint one, but that one was a big one just because of his background. Recently, I was able to interview a person that I hadn't known much about, but had been in marketing since like in the 90s. So that was a one for my specific show that stood out. But there's just been so many good things that it's hard to really pinpoint one.
In America right now, there's a big issue with diversity. Just like in the military, it took a long time for a lot of people to reach certain ranks. Is the military podcast network diversified?
I would say it is and will be more. That's a big deal. I don't say it's hard for me in a way to say, like, I think people and entities and corporations and everybody in life and Bunker Labs, all these different entities should always be striving to do better at that. So I don't think there's a place where you ever, okay, we're good, we've checked that block, we're done. Like, I think you continue to, in my opinion, in the 20 years I didn't serve, diversity was what made us. I mean, I learned so much. Like the things that we were able to do and push ourselves out in, the more diverse we were, the better off that is. So I think you can only get better by making sure you get better. So those things I've had in mind from the beginning of being highlighting like the different things from a diverse perspective, and continue to make sure like when I did a logo, like I don't want it to look like it's a male or a female thing, so everything in the lens of like bringing people together and bringing people's perspectives and backgrounds from a diverse perspective. So I say yes, it is diverse, but it could be more diverse, and will continue to be.
Absolutely. Well, when you really sat down and said this is what you wanted to do, what was your projection in actually seeing everything be at the level you wanted to be? Did you have a time frame where you wanted to say, okay, this network should take off within 5 years?
That's a great question, and I would probably say, I would say I have not done that well enough. I felt, if anything, it was a long-term vision and thing, and so I continue to need to improve that of like, okay, like how you, and that actually could go maybe back to the initial or some things that are hard is like, okay, like how, if you've never done something like that, if you come out of a certain environment to a media perspective. I mean, I've thrown out like things like I could see it being $1 billion media company, but those are more aspirational. Like, what does that look like though? Like, it's not for the money part of it. It's more for the impact. So, in the beginning, I was so new to that kind of a thing to where I just saw podcasting becoming more of a way to get the message out, and was evolving. I mean, it's still early on, I feel. So it's, how can we get this message out in a bigger scale? That was the things I was focused on, of like the building out. But I wanted to make sure I say I a lot, but we as a company didn't just, I want 15 shows to have 15 shows, because what I didn't want is it to be so much driven by that it's not the right 15. So I'd rather have gone slow and have just a few that were the right ones, which I hate to say right or wrong, but like the ones that are line up values wise, than to have just quickly go out and get them for numbers sake, or for a 5-year hard, I want for sure this is where I want to be. So kind of balancing that, and that's why I probably could do better at that.
So are you taking applications in regards to hearing new content that could possibly go on the show?
Absolutely. Yep, for sure. So there's both the podcast I do on the network, the Veterans in Business show, that I'm always looking for people to come on that show. And also more people for, hey, I've got a podcast already I think would be a good fit for the network. And you probably have seen this. I'm like very accessible. So, of course, my email, I don't know if you want me to say it now, but okay, yeah. So later on, I'll say how to get a hold of me, but like email me. Like I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on every platform. So that's, we've had that throughout time of people reaching out. Hey, in different spaces or different, even military related to military units and stuff, reach out. So it's, that's an ongoing thing that we definitely process and stuff.
So clarify your podcast with the veterans businesses, where you have guests come on the show to speak about what?
So I'm usually looking for highlighting like Bunker Labs would be one example, like a program like Bunker Labs, of what that does for military veterans or military spouse businesses, or people wanting to get in business. So I would highlight programs like that on the show, or like interview the founder of Bunker Labs, or other entities or things like that and resources, but also interviewing people who like in Bunker Labs that have how that story has been for how they got into business and expanded it. So those are the content is the host, or I'm sorry, the guest that I'm usually looking for is people that either have value for the niche of the veteran or military person or military. I've had a military spouse on, so it's kind of interesting because I called it veterans business. And that was because I was kind of like that person, right, who was on that path of coming out of the military space and getting into business. And I've interviewed people on my show. That there's a friend of mine, Sean, who has a business and a podcast and is in the military now still. So I've had a military member, which I thought when I was in, a military person is a veteran, but I think technically you're not really a veteran until after. So, but those are some of the people that I've had on before and continue to have, and some civilians. The Chris Kremitzos that I was referring to earlier, I've had him on my podcast. That probably stood out. Another personal thing for me was kind of full circle to meet him early on when I had no idea what I was doing, and to now be doing things related to what I've learned being a part of his community.
So tell me, do you look for veterans, whether they're famous or non-famous, to the point where if you did have someone famous, wouldn't Colin Powell be a nice person to have?
Oh, absolutely. I don't. I think part of it just goes back to your comfortability or mine of like putting people on pedestals. I mean, that's been kind of a process for me of coming out of a place where you're really kind of, there's the officers and the enlisted, and there's, maybe open door policy with people, but you don't always feel comfortable to go talk to them, and you kind of have people that are more notorious than others. So yeah, absolutely, I would love. I would love an interview like that. The kind of catch-22 isn't the person I was talking about, Joe Polish, that I had on my show. When I interview someone like that, it's like feeling, like, okay, I want to do my best of interviewing and stuff like that. So yeah, for sure, that would be a good.
So what do you think that you can improve with Bunkers Lab? Because these are tips that gives my viewers insight into making sure that when they start their own podcast, they don't make those same mistakes, but they can learn early on how to have a solution already intact if that problem was to come about.
Yep, absolutely. Well, what I would say just in general on podcasts is there's plenty of information out there for people to start. And it doesn't have to be like, oh, I'm going to have to spend all this money. It's pretty minimal to get started, really. And so I would say for number one advice I always talk about to people is actually just starting the process. If you're doing a podcast, or like if your podcast is going to be just you talking, then start practicing, because you can record. You don't have to use that content. Same thing with an interview. Like maybe interview some people to where you get practice, because especially never having done something like that, the quicker you do that and get used to being, recording yourself and hearing yourself and getting practice interviewing, that's the number one thing I would say is just go out there and research and start.
So, I do have one more question for you, right? Outside of the fact that you're going to share your information, right? What makes it so important for you to get up in your day to do what you do? Why?
And that's what's interesting. For me, that's really goes back to why I wanted to do something like this. So for me, some of the things that I had done in my background and had done before, I talk a lot about where like I grew up being an electrician and could go be an electrician again. And I could get up probably every day and be excited to do something like that. But because I was in the military environment and felt like I was a part of something bigger than myself, and that's really a lot of people probably here in the veteran or military space where people have a hard time transitioning out of that environment and ever really finding purpose and fulfillment. So for me, by really having and getting the message out of what the military space is still doing or continues to do, and all those things, it's such a powerful thing that's bigger than any one person or me, that's what I focus on. That gets me out of bed each day, and I'm doing things that I would do for free or for paid. So that's what gets me up.
Well, I want to thank you, James, for coming on the show, and I look forward to seeing you more than often.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Terrence. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Before we close this deal, keep this in mind. Bunkers Lab. Learn more about it by going online and checking it out, but also look up the Military Podcast Network. We would love to hear from you. If you have suggestions, questions, or even want to apply to be a guest on the show, go to www.theclosethedealshow.com. San Francisco, LA. You can find us every Monday night on cable Comcast. Worldwide, find the Close the Deal Show on YouTube. Just type my name and click my picture, Terrence McCray. Please subscribe, like, and comment on your favorite episode. Take good care, everyone, and don't forget, find the right connection and close the deal.